Hello, my name is Matt Shar, and today I'll be doing a rebuttal of Dr. Bart Ehrman's case against the resurrection. Dr. Ehrman is one of the most highly trained New Testament scholars in the world and is an agnostic and anti-Christian apologist. So this is actually coming from his debate with Dr. Michael Icona a few years ago, and he provides his best case against the resurrection.
We will fundamentally disagree on the question about whether historians can prove Jesus was raised from the dead. I want to be clear that I am not arguing here that Jesus was not raised from the dead. That is not my argument. My argument has to do with if Jesus was raised from the dead, is that something that is susceptible to historical proof? Can that be proven by historians or not? That is the question I'm dealing with, not the question of whether the event actually happened. What I want to do in my talk is to talk about why it is historians cannot prove that Jesus was raised from the dead, and I'm going to have two major points. One area that I'm going to talk about has to do with what it is historians do for a living and what kind of things constitute proof for historians. Secondly, I'm going to look at the problems inherent with historians trying to demonstrate that miracles happen. And I will be arguing that historians, by the very nature of historical evidence, cannot ever prove that a miracle has happened, even if it did happen. It is beyond the realm of historical proof. But first, let me talk a little bit about what it is historians do. By and large, what historians do is establish what probably happened in the past. Historians establish what probably happened in the past. There are various levels of probability of what happened in the past, depending on what it is you're talking about. For example, if you want to decide what Bill Clinton was doing in 1992, you can pick almost any month and have a pretty well documented account of what Bill Clinton was doing in 1992, an account that would be convincing to all of us because you would have newspaper clippings, you would have magazine reports, you'd have TV clips, you would have lots of evidence. You'd have less evidence to discuss what Bill Clinton was doing in 1972, not inhaling or whatever. Because we have far less evidence of Bill Clinton in 1972 than we do in 1992. Less evidence, and historians want to have lots of evidence for the conclusions they draw. Suppose you move the clock back and you want to talk about William Shakespeare. My wife is a Shakespeare scholar writing a book right now on William Shakespeare. And one question that lay people often ask is, did Bill Shakespeare actually write those plays or not? Well, how do you know? What kind of evidence is there? In fact, there is evidence, but there's a lot less evidence than there is for knowing what Bill Clinton did in 1992 or even 1972. Move the clock back. Did Caesar cross the Rubicon? What kind of evidence do we have that Caesar crossed the Rubicon? Well, everybody knows he crossed the Rubicon. Well, but what's the evidence? What if somebody called it into question? How would you argue that he really did? What basis would you have for your belief that he crossed the Rubicon? How did Simon Peter die? I can say something with authority about these sources. We have terrible sources for knowing how Simon Peter died. Our earliest accounts are late 2nd century, 100 years afterwards, accounts that are filled with legendary details, many of which are quite amusing and funny and make for great entertainment in terms of reading, but the idea that Simon Peter was crucified upside down in Rome, that is a later legend. Did it really happen? Well, it's really, really hard to prove because we just don't have the kinds of sources. Historians have to base what they say on the existence of sources of evidence. Whether you're talking about Bill Clinton, William Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, or Simon Peter. You have to have sources of information. Now, for some people, this comes as a little bit of a surprise because history just seems to be something we know. And so, for example, people just kind of know what Jesus said and did. Like, you were born with that knowledge. And so there's no question about it because you've always heard certain things, and so those things are probably true. But if you're a historian, you can't accept what everybody's always said. You have to try and establish what really happened in the past, to establish what Jesus said, to establish what he did, to establish what happened to Simon Peter or to William Shakespeare, etc. Historians have to have evidence. Well, what kind of evidence do they look for? The best kind of evidence when dealing with ancient periods is to find evidence that goes back to the time itself. If you had some contemporary eyewitnesses telling you how Simon Peter died, that would be brilliant. Unfortunately, you don't have that. You would love, though, to have contemporary accounts written like the next day from the events. That would be great. Historians would love that kind of thing. Historians would love to have lots of sources. You want to have lots of sources that go back to the time of the events that are being narrated. You would like these sources to be independent of one another. If you have 20 sources, but they all got their story from the same guy, then you don't have 20 sources, you have one source. You want 20 independent sources who all attest the same event. Moreover, you want these independent sources to be consistent with one another. You don't want them to be contradicting each other all over the map. You want them to be agreeing with one another. So you want them to corroborate one another without collaborating with one another. Moreover, you want them to be unbiased toward the subject matter. You don't want them to be skewing things in light of their own self-interests, if you're an ancient historian trying to establish what probably happened in the past.
Dr. Ehrman listed a few criteria by which we can determine the trustworthiness of a historical record. The first is contemporary witness testimony, or information that's coming from people who lived in the time and place in which the events were reported. While it is likely true that the Gospels weren't put into written form until a few decades after the life of Jesus, the information is coming from the people who actually witnessed the events themselves and were around for his ministry. It's just that they passed on the information orally until such a time as it was deemed appropriate for a historical biography to be written of Jesus. So the people living in that time and place just did what they naturally did because ancient Israel was an oral culture. Only about 5% of people were even capable of writing, and only a small fraction of that 5% were capable of composing something as complex as a gospel. So they just did what they naturally did and passed on the information in the way that they would naturally pass on information, and it would be anachronistic for us to expect for them to have done it otherwise. It would be very similar to you and your friends witnessing a crime, and then not telling the police about it, but discussing it amongst yourselves over the course of decades, meeting on a weekly basis to discuss the impact that it had on your lives, and rehearsing from your memory the events that unfolded, and then the police finding out about it at a later time, and then collecting your testimony and then putting it then into written form. The information contained in that report would absolutely be contemporary witness testimony. It's just that it was passed along in oral form until such a time as it was deemed appropriate for it to be put into written form. The next two things that he lists are that you want multiple sources which are independent of one another and who corroborate each other on the important details of the information that they're passing on. So the New Testament was actually composed by at least 8 different authors who all corroborate the divinity and resurrection of Jesus. These people come from a variety of backgrounds, and they include people who are Jesus' immediate family members, like James and Jude, and Jesus' best friends, like John and Peter. Then we also have the epistles of Paul, who is the most violent opposer of the Christian movement, who also openly declares the resurrection and divinity of Jesus. Then we have the Gospels, which were written by 4 of the most highly intelligent and specially trained people living in ancient Israel and Rome. So the New Testament actually does have multiple authors who are independent from various backgrounds who all testify to the same basic facts. The next thing that he lists is that you want people who are unbiased towards the subject. While this is true, it is a little unrealistic to expect that people could witness the events like those described in the New Testament and then walk away being totally unbiased towards the subject. So they would either be biased in favor of trying to convince you to be a Christian because they felt that that is the only way for you to be saved, or they would be biased against you being a Christian because they want you to not be believing something that constitutes blasphemy.
What kind of sources do we have when it comes to the Gospels? The Gospels are our sources for knowing about the resurrection of Jesus. Are they the kind of sources that historians would want when trying to establish what probably happened in the past? I think the answer to that question is no. When were the Gospels written? Well, they are not contemporary to the events they narrate. Scholars debate when the Gospels were written, but by far the most common datings are that Mark was written sometime around 65 or 70 AD. Luke and Matthew about 10 or 15 years later. John maybe 10 or 15 years later. So John maybe around the year 90 or 95. Matthew and Luke around 80 to 85. These are the dates that are taught throughout the universities and divinity schools and seminaries of North America and Europe. I take them to be right for reasons that I can give you if anybody really wants to know. It's complicated arguments. If these dates are correct, it means that our earliest account of Jesus' resurrection is 40 years after the event. 40 years after the event. Well, Paul was writing before that, wasn't it? Yes, Paul was writing before that. Paul talks about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians. Well, that's 20 years after the event, so that's better. The Gospels give us the narratives. Paul makes reference to it, but there's a 20-year gap. You don't have somebody who was there writing about it. Second point, none of the authors were eyewitnesses. Paul himself indicates that he was not an eyewitness, and none of the gospel writers was an eyewitness. People, of course, call the gospel books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, they call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because we don't know who wrote these books, and there's no point calling them Sam, Fred, Jerry, and Harry. I mean, they're written by people. We don't know who they were written by. They are anonymous. You might not think so because they have the title, The Gospel According to Matthew. Whoever put that title on it was an editor later. The original books are all anonymous, written in the third person. Moreover, the followers of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking peasants from Galilee, lower-class men who were not educated. In fact, Peter and John in Acts chapter 4, verse 13, are literally said to be illiterate. They couldn't read and write. Of course not. They were fishermen. They didn't go to school. The vast majority of people in the ancient world never learned to read, let alone write. And their native language was Aramaic. These books are written in Greek by highly educated, rhetorically trained writers who are skilled in Greek composition. Probably not disciples and don't claim to be disciples. Where did these authors get their stories from? Well, if they were not disciples of Jesus, they must have heard the stories from somebody, who heard the stories from somebody, who heard the stories from somebody, who heard them from somebody. Stories about Jesus, including his resurrection, had been in circulation year after year after year from the time that his disciples knew that he got killed and believed he got raised from the dead. They told stories to convert people. They improved the stories sometimes. They changed the stories sometimes. The stories got modified in the process of transmission over the course of decades before anybody wrote the stories down. These stories are based on oral reports that have been in circulation for decades. What happens to oral reports in circulation year after year, decade after decade? They get changed.
Dr. Ehrman compares the spread of the gospel message being like the telephone game, where one person tells another person who tells another person who tells another person, then eventually, about 30 to 40 years later, it reaches Rome, where Mark composes his gospel. Then Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source in composing their narratives. Well, when considering this, it's actually very important to understand how the gospel message actually spread and how the message actually arrived in Rome. So Paul, the apostle, actually spent 1 year in Jerusalem between 50 and 51 AD. And so during this time, the Jerusalem Council was held, and Paul spent that entire year conferring with the Jerusalem apostles, ensuring that he had an accurate understanding of the gospel message as delivered by them. So then Paul took this message and spread it across the Roman Empire during his second missionary journey, at which time he went to multiple independent cities and instructed the people on the life and ministry of Jesus and the gospel message as delivered by the Jerusalem apostles. At that time, he went back to Jerusalem. About 10 years later, he was arrested, and then he was taken to Rome. So then he spent about 2 to 4 years on house arrest in Rome, where he was able to meet regularly with the Roman Christians. So that would be between 61 and 64 AD, and then Mark was written between 65 and 70 AD. So it's not at all similar to the telephone game. The telephone game being one person tells one person who tells another, and then on down the line, and the story gets corrupted. It would be more like the telephone game where the first person tells the second person, then the second person goes around and teaches the entire school what the message was from the first person, then comes back, tells the entire class, and speaks to the last person just before they take their turn. In that kind of a situation, the message would be easily preserved, and there would be a wide group of people who could correct it if anything was changed or if the message was delivered improperly. Dr. Ehrman mentions that he believes that the first followers of Jesus couldn't have been responsible for composing the Gospels because he believes the first followers of Jesus to have all been illiterate peasants who spoke only Aramaic, whereas the Gospel authors are all highly educated people from the upper class of society and were classically trained in Koine Greek. So this is clearly taking aggregate data and applying it to a specific situation. So it's entirely possible that these people, having been so highly educated, could have easily spoken two languages. And also, he's just assuming that all of the first followers were illiterate peasants and that nobody from the upper class would have initially followed Jesus. Like if I was to tell you a story about a firefighter and said that he had a master's degree, and then somebody looking at the story much later would look at it and say, well, most firefighters don't have master's degrees. While it might be true that most don't, that doesn't mean that all don't. Dr. Ehrman also mentions that the Gospels, having been written in the third person, indicates that they are not eyewitnesses to the events. Well, if you actually read the Gospel of John and go to chapter 21, verses 20 through 24, he indicates that he is the disciple of love mentioned throughout the Gospels, and that he himself is bearing witness to the events and actually is the one who is composing the narrative. So Dr. Ehrman indicating that he believes that the first followers to have been illiterate and uneducated, meaning so that they couldn't have been responsible for composing the Gospels, is sort of ignoring the fact that there was the time gap between the actual events that took place and the composition of the Gospels, which left plenty of time for the Gospel authors to receive the education that they needed in order to compose something like a Gospel.
What evidence do we have that the stories about Jesus' death and resurrection got changed? You can read the stories yourself. Simply read Mark's account of Jesus' death and then read John's account of Jesus' death and make a list of everything that happens in both and compare your lists. You will find that there are stunning differences. In fact, there are discrepancies. Let me give you just a list of very quick examples. What day did Jesus die on? That's a simple question. And luckily, we're told in both Mark and John. In Mark's gospel, we're told that Jesus died the day after the Passover meal was eaten in Jerusalem. John tells us explicitly, chapter 19, verse 14, that Jesus died the day before the Passover meal was eaten, on the day of preparation for the Passover. That's different. He couldn't die both days.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there to be a discrepancy regarding the day of Jesus' death between the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the Gospel of John. Dr. Ehrman states that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus has the Passover meal on Thursday night, then he's arrested, tried over that evening, and then crucified the following morning. But in John chapter 19, verse 14, it states the following. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, Behold, your king. This discrepancy is easily resolved by understanding the fact that the Passover was actually a whole week of festivals in ancient Israel, and the day of preparation was a common euphemism for Friday, in the same way that we would use the Lord's Day for Sunday. If you read just a few verses down, in verse 31 of John chapter 19, it states the following. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked that Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. This is because the Jewish people were very particular about their burial practices, specifically with people who were killed in the way that Jesus was, and following the command issued in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22. So the Sabbath was to begin that evening, so they needed the bodies to be taken down. This clearly indicates that Jesus was crucified on Friday in the Gospel of John as well. Also, if you read John chapter 13, verse 21 through 30, it clearly has Jesus eating the Passover meal with his disciples and having the same conversation as is had in the Synoptic Gospels on the Passover evening. The day of preparation of the Passover, mentioned in the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 14, is describing the day of preparation for the Sabbath of Passover week that was to begin that evening.
What about the time? According to Mark, he died at 9 in the morning. According to John, he wasn't condemned to death until afternoon. John 19:14.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there to be a discrepancy regarding the time of Jesus' execution between the Synoptic Gospels and John. This discrepancy is easily reconciled by recognizing the fact that the Synoptic Gospels use a Jewish method of counting time, whereas the Gospel of John is using a Gentile method of counting time. Also, the Gospel of John states the time of Jesus' torture beginning, whereas the Synoptic Gospels mention the time that Jesus' crucifixion actually happened.
These are accounts that differ from one another. Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way to Golgotha, or did Simon of Cyrene carry it? It depends which gospel you read.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there to be a contradiction between the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John with respect to who carried Jesus' cross. In Matthew 27, verse 32, it states the following: As they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. They compelled this man to carry his cross. However, in John chapter 19, verse 17, it states the following: And he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. This discrepancy is easily resolved by understanding the fact that the word xylon actually just means a wooden beam. So there actually was an upright beam with a transverse beam, so there could be both of them carrying a xylon, or it's possible that Jesus, after having been beaten so severely, couldn't carry the weight of his cross anymore, so they compelled Simon of Cyrene to carry it the rest of the way. This is in keeping with Roman law, which indicated that a Jewish male had to help a Roman soldier to carry a burden at least 1 mile, which is where the statement that if a person is to make you carry a burden for 1 mile, carry it for 2, comes from in the Gospels.
Did both robbers mock Jesus, or did only one of them mock him and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there to be a contradiction with respect to the robbers who were crucified with Jesus and whether they both mocked him or only one did. Since they were hanging on the cross for at least 3 hours together, it is entirely possible that both robbers mocked him as he approached and was first crucified, but then one of them, after thinking about it and recognizing that his end was near, came to his senses and repented, turning in defense of Jesus and asking for salvation. Jesus, in turn, responds with an offer of grace and an assurance of salvation for the robber who was crucified with him.
Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died, or was it after he died? It depends which gospel you read. I can give you the references for all of these if you need me to, or you can look them up yourself. I'm not making these up.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there to be a discrepancy with respect to whether the curtain in the temple was torn prior to or after Jesus' death while he was on the cross. This is because Mark chapter 15, verse 37 and 38 states, And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And Matthew 27, 50 through 51 states, And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And, behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. Whereas Luke 23:44 through 46 states, It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, and having breathed his last. This is not a contradiction, because Matthew and Mark both just state that both things happened, whereas Luke gives a chronology.
The historian can tell you that Jesus was crucified. Historians, I agree with Mike completely. Historians will tell you that Jesus was crucified. This is, I believe, about as a certain historical datum as you can get from the ancient world, that Jesus Christ was crucified under Pontius Pilate.
Notice that Dr. Ehrman states that the crucifixion of Jesus, as described in the Gospels, is about as certain of historical data as one can ask for from the first century. So the so-called discrepancies that he listed don't actually impact the trustworthiness of the account of the crucifixion whatsoever. So he's going to go on to list the same kinds of so-called discrepancies for the resurrection narrative, but these discrepancies shouldn't alter our trust in the resurrection at all, since they don't alter our trust in the crucifixion. The only difference between the two is that one is not a miracle and one is a miracle.
Those are just differences about Jesus' death. What about differences in the accounts of his resurrection? Well, who went to the tomb on the third day? Did Mary Magdalene go alone, or did Mary go with other women? Depends which gospel you read. If with other women, how many of them were there? What were their names? And which ones were they? It depends which gospels you read.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there to be a discrepancy with respect to who first visited Jesus' tomb on the Sunday morning of his resurrection. Mark chapter 16, verse 1 states, "When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him." Luke 23, verse 55 states, "The women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid," and goes on to say in Luke 24, verse 1, "But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they," meaning the women who had followed him from Galilee, "went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared." Matthew 28, verse 1 states, "Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb." John chapter 20, verse 1 states, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark." These are not contradictions. Mark gives the full list, then the other gospel writers just focus on specific characters for their own purposes. If one story said, Matt, Sarah, and their children went to the store, then another said, Matt, Sarah, and Ashley went to the store, then another said, the Shars went to the store, and another said, Matt went to the store, none of these would contradict. One gives the full list, and the others just highlight specific characters for their author's own purposes.
Was the stone rolled away before the women got to the tomb or not?
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there is a discrepancy with respect to whether the stone had been rolled away prior to the women's arrival at the tomb or after. In Mark 16, verses 2 through 4, it states the following, "And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb, and were saying to one another, Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large." Luke 24, verses 1 and 2 state, "But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb taking spices they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb." Now, John 20, verse 1 states, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb." Whereas Matthew 28, verses 1 and 2 state, "Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb, and behold, there was a large earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it." This is not a contradiction, because Matthew is just giving a fuller description of what happened prior to the women's arrival and how it is that the stone had come to be rolled away from the entrance of the tomb.
What did they see in the tomb? Did they see a man? Did they see two men? Or did they see an angel? Depends which gospel you read.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there to be a discrepancy with respect to what the women saw after their arrival at the tomb. Mark 16, verse 5 states, "And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed." Luke 24, verse 4 states, "While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel." And Matthew 28, verse 5 says, "But the angel said to the women, Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus, who was crucified." This is not a discrepancy, because Luke gives the full list, and Mark and Matthew focus on one individual, the angel who actually talked with the women. It is not at all uncommon in the Bible for an angel to appear and it just to say that a man appeared. In fact, when Jacob wrestles with God in Genesis chapter 32, it states that he wrestled with a man.
What were they told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to stay in Jerusalem to see Jesus, or were they supposed to go to Galilee? Depends which gospel you read.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there to be a discrepancy with respect to the command that the angels gave the women after their arrival at the tomb, and what they were to go and tell the disciples with respect to where they were supposed to go. Mark chapter 16, verse 7 states, "But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Matthew 28, verse 7 states, "Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you." Luke does not mention the command given by the angels to the women about where the disciples were supposed to go, but in Luke chapter 24, verse 13, it picks up the story and states, "That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him." So Matthew and Mark give the command of the angel and where the disciples were supposed to go, And then Luke picks up the story as they're following it, going to Emmaus in Galilee. After their arrival, when Jesus makes himself known to them, Jesus commands them to remain in Jerusalem until they're clothed with power from on high, which was to come on Pentecost.
Did the women tell anybody, or were they silent about it? Depends which gospel you read.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there to be a discrepancy with respect to whether or not the women went and told the disciples after their discovery of the empty tomb and discussion with the angels. In Mark chapter 16, verse 8, it states, "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." At this point, the earliest and best manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark end, so the Gospel of Mark ends without the women having told the disciples. Then in Matthew 28, verse 8, it states, "So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples." Then in Luke 24, verse 9, it states, "And returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest." Then in John chapter 20, verse 18, it states, "Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, 'I have seen the Lord,' and that he had said these things to her." In order for this to be a discrepancy, one would have to believe that the woman didn't follow the command of the angels, which is very clear from the other Gospels that they absolutely did. And it's also obvious that the women, having not said anything, didn't say anything to anybody in between finding and discovering the empty tomb and talking with the angels and their arrival wherever the disciples were staying.
Did the disciples ever leave Jerusalem? Or did they never leave, or did they leave and go to Galilee? Depends which gospel you read.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that he believes there to be a discrepancy with respect to whether the disciples remained in Jerusalem or if they went to Galilee. Matthew chapter 28, verse 16 and 17 states the following, "Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them, and when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted." Whereas Luke chapter 24, verse 49 through 53 states, "And behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you, but stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high." And he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands he blessed them. While he blessed them, he parted from them, and was carried up to heaven. And they worshipped him, and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they were continually in the temple blessing God. This is easily resolved by recognizing that the story in Matthew is Jesus commissioning the disciples in Galilee, whereas the story in Luke is describing the ascension as described in Acts. So the disciples went to Galilee as the angels instructed the women to tell them, where Jesus appeared to them. Then, after spending 40 days with them, he led them out to Bethany and was taken away in a cloud, at which point they returned to Jerusalem and waited till Pentecost.
My conclusion, these are not reliable historical accounts. There are too many discrepancies. The accounts are based on oral traditions that have been in circulation for decades. Year after year, Christians tried to convert others by telling them stories to convince them that Jesus was raised from the dead, and they changed their stories while trying to convince people. These authors were not eyewitnesses. They're Greek-speaking Christians living many years after the fact. They're telling stories that Christians have been telling all these years. There was nobody there taking notes. Some of the stories were invented, many were changed. For this reason, these accounts are not as useful as historians would like as historical sources.
Dr. Ehrman states that the Gospel authors were all living decades after the events that they narrate. While this is true, it doesn't mean that they were all born decades after the events that they narrate. They were likely contemporary to the events that they're describing in their Gospels, and they were all writing within the time that they had the ability to go and talk to the witnesses firsthand. Also, 30 to 40 years between events taking place and a historical biography being written of an ancient figure is actually pretty small by ancient standards, especially considering the fact that somebody like Alexander the Great, who died in the late 330s BC, didn't have his biography written until about 75 AD by Plutarch. Then somebody like Julius Caesar, who was an extremely famous king, didn't have his biography written until about 40 years after his life as well. So Jesus, having been an itinerant Jewish preacher who was executed as a blasphemer by the state, it's actually very amazing that we have so many historical biographies written so close to his life.
What I've given you so far is really just kind of child's play compared to the real problem of why historians cannot prove the resurrection. And this is what I want to spend my last 3.5 minutes on, the real problem. Mike and I agree that what historians try to do is establish what most probably happened in the past. That is the task of history. You can't prove the past, You can only give evidence for the past, and some evidence is more certain than other evidence. All the historian can do is show most probably what happened. What are miracles? Miracles, by definition, are the least probable occurrence of an event. If a miracle was not least probable, it wouldn't be a miracle. If somebody could walk across the lukewarm water in your swimming pool, that would be a miracle. If the water was frozen, it would not be a miracle. But if it's lukewarm, I can tell you, none of you here could do it, and nobody in this world could do it. That's 6 billion people, so what are the chances of one person being able to do it? It would defy the way nature naturally works. I'm not saying that there are natural laws that are written down someplace that you can't break or you get in big trouble. Scientists today don't talk about natural laws, but scientists do talk about highly predictable ways that this world works. And one of the way it works is that if you are a sentient human being trying to walk across the lukewarm water in your swimming pool, you won't be able to do it. What if somebody could do it? What would be the chances? The chances would be infinitesimally remote that anybody could do it. Well, what if somebody could? Okay, let's say somebody could. The chances of them being able to do it are infinitesimally remote. Can you prove that this person probably did it? No, you can't prove it because you can't repeat the experiment of the past to show he did it. That's the problem with history. It's not like the natural sciences. The natural sciences work by repeated demonstration. And so, for example, if I wanted to show you that bars of iron will sink in that swimming pool and bars of ivory soap will float, all I need to do is to get 100 bars of both and start chucking them in. I'll chuck in 100 bars of iron, they'll sink every time. I'll chuck in the soap, they'll float every time. That gives us a predictive probability of what will happen the 101st time. That's how sciences work, by repeated experimentation. Historians don't have that luxury. Historians can only establish on the basis of surviving evidence what probably happened in the past, and by definition, miracles are the least probable occurrence, or else they're not a miracle. This creates the dilemma for the historian and is the reason why historians cannot prove Jesus was raised from the dead. Historians, by their very nature, establish what most probably happened in the past, but a miracle, by its definition, is the least probable occurrence in the past. The least probable occurrence cannot be most probable. This is the problem with the resurrection. Even if it happened, it defies imagination and cannot be accepted as a historically proven event. Belief in the resurrection. If you believe in the resurrection, it is for theological reasons. The resurrection is a theological assertion about what God did to Jesus. It is not, and it cannot be, based on historical proof.
Dr. Ehrman indicates that a historian can never, on historical grounds, conclude that a miracle has taken place. This is obviously circular reasoning. He's just starting out with the assumption that God does not exist, and then interpreting any historical data through that assumption. So naturally, if one assumes that God doesn't exist out of hand, then they investigate any set of claims that are potentially miraculous. They're always going to come to the conclusion that it can't have happened. So what a person should actually do is be neutral to the God idea, and then when they're investigating history, look for claims of miracles and see if they meet the standard methods of historical investigation and are actually the best explanation for what could have taken place in the past, or if there are any reasonable alternative explanations that are non-miraculous. So with respect to the resurrection, all the other explanations are foolish, such as hallucinations or wrong tombs or stolen body. All of these pale in comparison with respect to explanatory scope, explanatory power, and the other explanations are ad hoc because the people who actually witnessed the events are very clear that they believe that Jesus bodily rose from the dead. And the only reason to doubt that that's the case is because one assumes that God doesn't exist. If one is neutral to the God idea, and then investigates history looking for what explains all the historical data best, it's very clear that the resurrection is the best explanation, and the only reason to deny it is because you just assume God doesn't exist out of hand, and that's circular reasoning. The standard that Dr. Ehrman is setting forth is a perfect example of spiritual blindness. So basically what he's saying is that in order for him to believe a miracle happened, miracles would have to be sufficiently common that they were statistically probable events, at which time he'd be willing to believe that they took place, but they would also cease to be extraordinary, so they would no longer be unique proofs of God revealing himself in the universe. So Dr. Ehrman is essentially saying that in order for us to believe that a miracle happened, it would have to no longer be a miracle. At which time, for us to try to prove that our God exists, we would have to cite events having taken place that were not statistically probable events and were uncommon, at which time he wouldn't believe them because they weren't statistically probable events. So this is obviously circular reasoning, and it's the reason that most non-believers will deny the resurrection as a historical event. As Christians, I think we should take great comfort in knowing that one of the most highly educated New Testament scholars in the world, who makes a living trying to discredit our faith, has what you just saw as his best explanation for why the resurrection cannot be a historical hypothesis. The fact that he's basing his entire argument on circular reasoning is evident that there are not really any better arguments for him to use against the resurrection as a historical event. It's not for lack of sincerity on the part of the apostles, it's not for a lack of testimony from history, and it's certainly not because the New Testament is lacking in any way compared to any other ancient document from that time. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.